I still remember the weight of that morning, the sky heavy with heat, the smell of dust rising from the red earth, and the sound of 1,000 voices fighting to be heard in the chaos of the market. Until suddenly, all of it stopped, and the world folded into a silence so thick that even the wind refused to move, and I knew in that suffocating stillness that something inside me was about to break forever. That morning began like every other. My knees pressed into the dirt, my fingers blackened with shoe polish and glue, the sun already biting into my back. Around me, the market roared with life, women shouting over prices of yam and pepper, children chasing one another through narrow aisles, the metallic ring of cobblers' hammers answering one another like an unending prayer. The air was thick with the smell of roasted corn and engine smoke. I had no clock, but I could tell time by the shadows that crept across my mother's old stool, the one I used as my workbench. I was repairing a torn leather sandal when the shouting began, sharp, angry, cutting through the noise like a whip. I looked up just in time to see a tall man in a white shirt, turning in circles, patting his pockets, his voice cracking, "My wallet! My wallet is gone!" The market went wild with murmurs. Someone's finger pointed in my direction before I could even breathe. "He was the one near you," another voice said. "The shoemaker boy. He's always watching people's things," someone added. And just like that, the ground beneath me gave way. My heart jumped to my throat. "I didn't take anything," I said, but my words disappeared beneath the sound of footsteps rushing toward me. Before I could stand, rough hands grabbed my collar. It was the mall security guard, the one with the cruel smile who'd told me many times never to sit near the gate. His grip was iron. "You again," he said, his breath hot and sour on my face. "I told you this place isn't for rats like you." I tried to explain, but his baton struck the ground beside me, a warning that silenced every word. The man in the white shirt shouted, "That's him. I saw him near my bag." I felt my legs tremble as they dragged me through the crowd. The world blurred, faces, colors, voices melting together in a haze of shame. People I'd fixed shoes for stepped aside. Some watched with pity, others with satisfaction. No one spoke for me. No one ever did. The guard pushed me toward the iron gate of the mall, that shining building of glass and marble where I wasn't even allowed to sweep the floor. The metal was cold against my cheek as he pressed me against it. "You think you belong here?" he sneered. "You think you can touch what's not yours?" He searched my pockets, my tool bag, even shook my sandals loose. Nothing. Of course, nothing. But it didn't matter. Truth had no place in that moment. All that mattered was what they believed. And they believed I was guilty. The crowd whispered, then laughed. Someone spat near my feet. The world became a blur of heat and humiliation. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence could feel louder than shouting. Every heartbeat pounded in my ears like drums of war. And then something inside me, something I didn't know I had, began to burn. It wasn't anger yet, not quite. It was something sharper, colder, like metal being forged in fire. The more they humiliated me, the more it grew. When they finally let go, I fell hard onto the dirt. The guard waved his baton toward the market. "Go fix your useless shoes where you belong," he said. I stood there for a moment, dizzy, my palms bleeding, my pride scattered like my tools. The crowd began to move again, pretending nothing had happened. The sounds of the market returned, haggling voices, children laughing, goats bleating. But to me, everything felt different, distant, hollow. I turned slowly, looking at the mall, the sunlight dancing across its glass doors, the golden sign glinting above the entrance like something unreachable. I could see my reflection in that glass, small, dirty, invisible. But deep inside, I felt something move, the first spark of a promise that would not die. I picked up my broken hammer, wiped the dust from my knees, and whispered words I didn't even plan to say. One day you'll open those gates for me." The guard turned, frowning, as if he'd heard something. But I had already started walking away, past the smell of burning oil and roasted maize, through the narrow path that led home, where the only voice that could still break me was waiting. That night, as the shadows stretched across our small room, my mother sat by the lamp, her hands trembling over her sewing. When she looked up at me, her eyes were darker than the night itself. "Tell me," she said quietly, "what did they do to you today?" And in that silence between her question and my answer, my real story began. That night the wind refused to sleep. It prowled through the cracks of our roof, carrying the smell of rain and rust, and every time it sighed, the flame of the oil lamp shivered as if afraid of the truth waiting to be spoken. I sat in the corner, nursing my bruises, trying to make myself small, while my mother's sewing machine clicked and clattered like a heartbeat too stubborn to die. She had always ruled our world with quiet, an unspoken strength that needed no voice. But that night, when she finally let her silence break, it felt as if the earth itself tilted, and everything I believed about her, about myself, and about the world we lived in, was stripped bare before me. The room was tiny, but her presence filled it like a storm about to break. I watched her shoulders move beneath her worn wrapper, saw how her back curved slightly with the weight of years and disappointment. The bruise on my cheek pulsed with the memory of that afternoon, the market, crowd, the hands that dragged me, the laughter that cut through my pride. I had hoped she wouldn't notice, that maybe the dim light would hide my shame. But a mother's eyes never sleep. Without turning, she said, "Close the door." Her voice was low, controlled, yet it carried a strength that froze me. I obeyed. The sound of the bolt sliding into place felt final, like sealing a confession. She kept working for a moment longer, the needle moving faster, the rhythm sharp and uneven. Then she stopped, her hand still on the cloth, and asked, "Why did you let them do this to you?" I tried to speak, but my throat locked. The words tangled inside me. Fear, humiliation, helplessness. I wanted to tell her I had done nothing wrong, that the guard had hated me long before the accusation, that the world saw dirt before it saw truth. But the way she turned to face me silenced everything. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, two wells of hurt, not just for me, but for herself, for everything life had taken from her. "They dragged my son like a thief," she said, and now her voice trembled, each word scraping the air, raw. "Do you know how many times I swallowed my pride so you could walk with your head high? And now they've touched what's mine. They've touched my name." She rose slowly, the chair groaning beneath her weight. For the first time, I saw the full map of exhaustion on her face, lines carved not by age, but by survival. She walked to the shelf and took down an envelope yellowed by years. Inside was a folded paper, edges frayed, letters fading, her teaching certificate. "This," she said, holding it up, "was once my weapon. I taught children whose fathers owned the land we live on now. I believed knowledge could change a person's worth. Then your father died. The debts came, and the world reminded me that dignity without money is just decoration." Her words cracked something inside me. I had always seen her as unbreakable, a wall between me and hunger. Now I saw the truth. She was breakable, but she chose not to break. She looked at me again. "You will be tempted to hate them, to curse every man who mocked you. But listen to me, my son. If you let anger guide your steps, you will walk the same road as those who hurt you." The lamp hissed, its flame thinning to a pale thread of light. Her shadow stretched long behind her, the walls breathing with each flicker. Outside, thunder rolled far away, and the smell of dust turned to rain. "Mama," I whispered, "how do I stay good when the world is cruel?" She smiled, but her eyes filled with something that looked like fear. "Goodness is not weakness," she said. "It is strength in disguise. They will try to make you forget that. Promise me you won't." I promised. though my voice barely reached the air between us. She placed her palm on my cheek, the same hand that had just wiped tears from her own, and for a moment, peace settled over me. But as she pulled away, I noticed the tremor in her fingers and the faint cough that followed, the one she tried to bury behind a smile. "Are you sick?" I asked. She shook her head, turning back to her sewing. "It's nothing. Go to sleep. Tomorrow will come." I lay down on my mat, the sound of her stitching weaving through the rain outside. The rhythm slowed, then stopped. The silence returned, thicker this time, filled with the things we hadn't said. Just when my eyes began to close, I heard her voice again, soft, shaking, yet clear enough to pierce the darkness. "Don't let pain turn you into them," she whispered. And though her words barely touched the air, they sank deep into me, deeper than the guard's baton, deeper than the crowd's laughter. And I knew even then that they would follow me for the rest of my life. The morning I met the stranger, the sky was the color of old iron, heavy and restless, as if it too was tired of watching the poor crawl beneath it. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and smoke from the food stalls, and each breath I took felt like swallowing a memory I didn't want to remember. I was sitting in my usual corner by the market fence, my fingers sticky with glue, my knees pressed against the earth that had known my sweat since childhood, when a shadow fell across my hands. Not sharp, not sudden, but deliberate, like the pause before a storm that knows exactly who it has come for. For a moment, I thought it was another customer, one of those men who toss their shoes at me without looking, as though feeding a stray dog. But when I looked up, the man towering over me wasn't like any I'd ever seen. His clothes looked like they belonged to a world where the ground was never dusty and the smell of the market never dared to reach. His suit was the color of dusk, his shoes gleamed like polished mirrors, and when the light hit his face, it wasn't the face that drew my attention. It was the stillness behind it, the kind that can only belong to a man who is used to power. He didn't speak right away. His eyes traveled to my hands, tracing every scar, every line hardened by years of labor. It was unsettling, being looked at like that. People usually saw my dirt before they saw my work. But this man's gaze wasn't disgusted. It was calculating, as though he were measuring something invisible, something even I didn't know I carried. "You stitched that woman's heel yesterday," he said, nodding toward a trader nearby. "It's neater than what I pay my foreman to produce." His voice was smooth but heavy, carrying the kind of authority that could open or close doors with a single word. I said nothing. Compliments from strangers often came with mockery hidden inside them. He crouched down beside me, and when he did, the noise of the market seemed to fade. "Do you know what precision is?" he asked. I blinked, unsure if it was a trick. "It's doing it right, sir." He smiled, faintly. "No, it's doing it right, even when no one is watching." His eyes stayed on my hands. "You have that. Most men don't." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black card with golden letters, and placed it carefully on the cloth beside my tools. Kanu Footwear Industries. I'd seen that name before, printed on the boxes of expensive shoes displayed at the mall. The same mall that had spat me out like trash only days ago. "I need someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing," he said. "Come to the city. Work under me. You'll learn what real craftsmanship is." My heart lurched. The city? His factory? It sounded like a dream pulled straight from someone else's life. But the way he said it, like it wasn't an offer, but a command, made my stomach twist. "Why me?" I asked quietly. He studied me again, and for a second I thought I saw something dark flicker in his expression, something colder than curiosity. "Because I recognize hunger when I see it," he said. "It's the only thing that can't be faked." Then, without another word, he stood and walked away, his shoes leaving no trace on the dust that clung to everyone else. That night, I sat by the dim lamp, the card lying on the table between me and my mother, like a piece of fate, too heavy to touch. She turned it over in her hands, reading the gold letters as though they were sacred. "Kanu," she whispered. "I used to know that name. Before—" Her voice trailed off. She set the card down and looked at me, not with excitement, but with worry. "You must go," she said softly, "but you must go with both eyes open. The world that offers gifts never gives them for free." I stared at her, caught between fear and hope. "What if I'm not good enough?" She smiled, tired but proud. "You already are. You just don't believe it yet." By dawn, I had packed what little I owned, a torn shirt, my tools, and the memory of her words. The car that came for me gleamed like a moving mirror, its windows dark, its driver silent. When I stepped inside, the leather seat swallowed me whole, and for the first time, I felt both smaller and larger than I'd ever been. The city grew out of the horizon like a secret that didn't want to be found. Buildings replaced trees. Silence replaced the market's laughter. I pressed my hand against the window, watching everything I knew fade behind me. Mr. Kanu sat beside me, unreadable, his gaze fixed ahead. His presence filled the car like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. I wanted to speak, but fear kept my tongue still. Halfway through the drive, his assistant, a tall man with a scar cutting across his cheek, turned slightly and studied me. His eyes held something unsettling, not curiosity, not hostility, something in between. He smirked faintly. "You remind him of someone," he said. "Who?" I asked. He leaned back, his smile fading. "Someone he destroyed." I turned toward Mr. Kanu, but he didn't move, didn't blink, as if the name of the ghost he'd once buried had just stepped into his car, wearing my face. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't been offered a chance. I'd been invited into a story that might already know how it ends. The first breath I took inside the factory burned my throat, not because of smoke or dust, but because the air itself seemed to carry secrets, old ones that whispered through the whir of machines, secrets stitched into the leather and trapped beneath the rhythm of hammers beating in perfect, punishing harmony. I remember thinking that this place did not smell merely of polish and glue. It smelled of sweat that had forgotten freedom, of dreams flattened beneath time, of ambition carefully perfumed to hide its rot. The building stood at the city's edge, a gray beast of concrete and tin whose windows gleamed like wet eyes. From the moment I stepped across the threshold behind Mr. Kanu, I felt its hunger. It was the kind of place that didn't just use hands. It swallowed spirits whole and taught them to move like parts of its body. The floor trembled under the weight of endless machines. Belts hissed, needles sang, metal struck metal in a rhythm too precise to belong to humans. Kanu walked ahead without looking back, his shoes silent even here, as if the factory feared to touch him. Workers bent over their stations, faces half hidden by masks of dust and fatigue. No one spoke. Even greetings seemed forbidden, as though words might slow production or expose truth. He stopped beside an old man, whose fingers moved faster than sight. "Musa," Kanu said, his tone clipped. "Teach this one the language of work." The old man's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and tired at once. He nodded, handed me a square of calfskin, and said, "Every cut has memory. Treat it like flesh, not material." From that day forward, the factory became both my school and my prison. I learned how to breathe with the machines, how to stretch leather until it obeyed, how to feel balance through fingertips alone. My hands blistered, healed, blistered again until the pain became rhythm. I earned quiet respect from a few, silent envy from others. But I also learned that every compliment carried a shadow. Musa rarely spoke, but when he did, his words sank deep. "You have a gift," he said once, "but gifts draw eyes. Keep your head down." His glance darted toward the upper floor, where the supervisor's glass office overlooked the floor, like a watchtower. At night, I began to notice things. The way ledgers changed hands after dark, the quiet exchanges between foremen, the sudden disappearance of workers who asked the wrong questions. Sometimes I saw Mr. Kanu himself pacing that glass room long after midnight, lights flickering around him like fireflies around a predator. One evening, while delivering finished pairs to storage, I glimpsed an open ledger on the foreman's desk. Columns of numbers glimmered in the lamplight, sales that didn't match production, names of buyers that existed only in ink. My curiosity was a wound that wouldn't heal. I told myself I was only looking, but I knew I was trespassing. The next day, Kanu summoned me upstairs. The corridor smelled different here, expensive cologne layered over the same industrial dust, like perfume masking decay. He didn't greet me. He simply pushed a heavy book across the desk. "Learn these records," he said. "Understand how profit breathes. A craftsman who cannot count the cost is still a servant." I nodded, but his gaze lingered until silence became threat. That night, under the single bulb in my room, I opened the book. The ink was elegant, the lies more so. Whole shipments vanished between one page and the next. Signatures changed shape like snakes shedding skin. The deeper I read, the clearer it became that the numbers weren't meant to balance. They were meant to deceive. When I returned the ledger, Kanu's smile was calm enough to frighten. "You read everything?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "And what did you find?" "Nothing I wasn't supposed to. He studied with me for a long time." "Good," he said softly. "Loyalty is knowing when to be blind." After that day, the factory seemed to watch me. The foreman's eyes followed me between aisles. Workers whispered when I passed. Even Musa grew distant, his words reduced to nods. Then one night, as the final bell rang, he pressed a scrap of paper into my palm. "If you value your breath, do not come tomorrow." Before I could ask, he vanished into the crowd spilling through the gates. Sleep avoided me. I turned his note over until dawn, each word biting deeper. Fear told me to stay away. Pride told me to face whatever waited. When morning came, I chose pride. The gates groaned open to a silence I'd never heard there before. Machines idle, air heavy. I walked through aisles of empty benches until I reached the office corridor. The door to Kanu's room stood ajar, light flickering from within. On the desk lay nothing. No ledgers, no papers, no trace of the numbers I had studied. Only a single pen, still wet with ink. My heart stuttered. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how loud my breathing sounded in the quiet. Then a voice behind me, smooth as oil, yet colder than metal, whispered, "Curiosity looks good on you, but it doesn't pay well." I turned to see Kanu standing in the doorway, the lock clicking shut behind him. The machines outside began to roar again, drowning out the sound of my heartbeat. The night it happened, the sky above the factory hung heavy and bruised, as if the city itself had forgotten how to breathe. The air pressed against the windows like a warning, the machines inside pounding out their rhythm of obedience, while the scent of leather and oil rose thick enough to taste. It was a night that promised rain, but delivered only smoke. And though every lamp burned with the same yellow fatigue as the men beneath them, there was something different in the way the shadows moved. Slow, deliberate, almost human, as if the building knew that before dawn, someone's truth would be buried beneath its floor. I had worked late, the hum of the machines echoing inside my skull long after they stopped. The others had gone, leaving behind the ghost of their sweat and the quiet resentment that always floated through the corridors once Kanu's voice was gone. I cleaned my bench, stacked the finished shoes, and told myself that tomorrow might be the day the city finally noticed me. Not as a laborer, but as the maker of things fine enough to survive. I didn't know the trap was already set, that every dream I had ever stitched together was about to come undone by hands that smelled of envy. The storm broke just before midnight. Rain hammered the tin roof so hard It drowned the machine's echo. I heard footsteps, quick and nervous, and then the foreman's shout slicing through the noise. "Everyone back inside!" Men stumbled from the dormitories half awake. When I stepped through the doorway, I saw him standing there with the velvet pouch gleaming in his hand, like a piece of sin caught in a lamplight. He opened it, poured its contents across my table. 2 gold cufflinks, small but dazzling enough to blind reason. "Found in his locker," he said, his voice already tasting victory. Every head turned toward me. Even the rain seemed to pause, waiting for my denial to fall useless to the floor. "That's not mine," I said. My words felt smaller than the space they entered. Kanu appeared at the top of the stairway, immaculate as always, his coat untouched by the storm. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, the echo of his shoes like a verdict. "Do you know what these cost?" he asked, holding the cufflinks between his fingers. "More than you will earn in a year." I felt the eyes of every worker pressing into my back, Musa's full of pity, Chaka's glittering with triumph. "I didn't take them," I said again. Kanu studied me the way a hawk studies movement before the strike. "It's always the honest ones who sound rehearsed," he murmured. Then louder. "You were trusted with the ledgers. You had access no one else did. You think I wouldn't notice?" He could have ended it there, quietly, but humiliation was the point. He wanted to remind everyone what happened to men who rose too fast. 2 guards stepped forward, their hands rough on my arms. The room spun, the same taste of iron, the same disbelief, as memory folded over itself, carrying me back to the mall gate years ago, to the sound of accusation, to the laughter of strangers who enjoyed watching a boy crumble. "Sir, please," I began, but the words turned to ash. He wasn't listening. He didn't need to. The story had already been written. They dragged me through the factory floor. Boots splashed through, puddles forming from the leaking roof. Tools crashed to the ground. Somewhere, a machine still rattled on, refusing to stop. I saw Musa step forward as if to speak, then freeze when Kanu's gaze met his. The fear in that moment told me everything. The factory didn't run on labor. It ran on silence. Outside, the rain swallowed my voice. The gates yawned open, the city's lights bleeding into the night like distant fire. Kanu stopped beside me, water sliding down his face, though his expression never changed. "You should have learned," he said quietly, "that some stories aren't meant for your kind to rewrite." "I never stole anything," I whispered. He smiled, the same thin smile that once felt like approval. "No," he said, "you just forgot who holds the pen." The guards shoved me forward, and the gates slammed behind me. The sound echoed like thunder that refused to die. I stood there for a long time, the rain washing dirt into the cracks of my hands, wondering how a man could be accused twice in one lifetime and still not understand the crime. When I finally looked back, the factory's lights glowed faintly through the storm, each window a reminder of everything I'd lost. And then, through the curtain of rain, movement caught my eye. High above, on the balcony outside the glass office, Mr. Kanu stood motionless, a silhouette framed by lightning. His gaze met mine for a heartbeat, and then his mouth curved, not in mockery, not in mercy, but in the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan unfold exactly as he intended. That smile followed me into the darkness, and for the first time I understood. I had not been cast out. I had been positioned. The night I found that shoe, the world felt as though it had forgotten me entirely. The streets lay silent beneath a blanket of rain. The moon hid behind clouds heavy with secrets, and the city breathed in slow exhaustion, indifferent to the small man crouched beneath a flickering lamppost, stitching pieces of other people's lives back together. It was just a shoe, creased, torn, its sole half-eaten by time. But as I held it beneath the weak light, water dripping from my eyelashes onto the leather, something inside me whispered that not every broken thing was meant to be discarded, and perhaps not every man cast aside was meant to stay forgotten. After the factory threw me into the storm, I wandered for days, the humiliation of that night living under my skin like a fever. The city that once glittered with opportunity now looked like an open mouth full of broken teeth. Dangerous, beautiful, uncaring. I slept under awnings, behind market stalls, wherever the rain could not reach. My hands itched for the rhythm they knew best, the slow pull of thread, the measured tap of a hammer. But I had nothing left except my mother's last words, echoing like an unending prayer. Don't let pain turn you into them. It was hunger that drove me to pick up the old shoe from the gutter. That night, the market had emptied, leaving behind debris and echoes. The shoe looked abandoned, but when I lifted it, I could see the story of its owner written in every crease. The uneven wear of a man who worked too long on his feet. The cracked leather near the toes, where the world had pressed hardest. I had been that man once. I understood. I took it to the narrow room I'd managed to rent behind a food stall, a space that smelled of kerosene and hope gone stale. I laid out the few tools that had survived my dismissal. A bent awl, a dull knife, a spool of thread so thin it could barely hold together its own shape, and I began to work. Each stitch was a prayer. I didn't know how to speak aloud. The needle pierced the leather, and with every pull I remembered something I'd lost. My mother's laugh, Moose's warning, the echo of the factory machines that had turned against me. The candlelight wavered, and for a moment I imagined she was sitting beside me, humming the old song she used to sew by. When I finished, the shoe didn't look new, but it looked alive again. Its scars hadn't vanished. They'd become part of its beauty. I sat back, breath trembling, realizing that I had not just mended a shoe. I had mended something inside myself. The next evening, I placed it outside my door, unsure why. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone would notice. By morning, it was gone. In its place, 2 more waited, each one just as broken. I worked on them too. Then 4, then 10. Word spread quietly through the alleys. There's a man who can make old shoes walk again. Drivers, traders, porters, they came at night, whispering through the door, leaving their burdens behind. I charged little, sometimes nothing. What I wanted more than money was the sound of people knocking, not because they pitied me, but because they believed I could make something whole. As days turned into weeks, I found myself perfecting a new kind of stitch, born not of design, but of desperation. I began curving the thread in patterns that mimicked the veins of a leaf, strengthening the soul from within. It made the shoes flexible, almost alive beneath the foot. The secret wasn't in the thread. It was in the faith I poured into it. That innovation, born from ruin, became my signature without me knowing it. People began to say my shoes breathed. They didn't just hold the feet. They carried the story. One night, as I worked late, a young boy appeared at my door with his father's boots, split open at the heel. "He said you fix what others throw away," the boy said, eyes wide. I nodded, taking the boots gently. "Your father will walk proud again." When the boy returned the next morning, his father came too, his steps uneven, but his smile steady. "You gave these old things a second life," he said, "so I'll tell everyone you gave me one too." And just like that, the world began to shift. Small orders turned to big ones. Men from better streets came, quietly, ashamed to be seen in this part of town, but desperate to have their shoes touched by the man who fixed the impossible. My hands found their purpose again, and for the first time since the factory, I didn't dream of revenge. I dreamed of creation. But destiny never comes without a shadow. I started noticing small things. The same car parked across from my workshop 2 nights in a row. The same silhouette leaning against the lamppost watching as I worked. At first, I thought it was paranoia, the leftover fear of a man who had lost too much. But then came the morning that proved me wrong. The dawn broke pale and cold. I opened my door to sweep the threshold, and stopped. There, resting perfectly in the center of the step, was a box made of dark mahogany, polished to a shine that caught the light like fire. My name wasn't written in full, only initials burned into the wood. M.K. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in silk, lay a single shoe, gold-plated, untouched. The design was unmistakable, my own stitching pattern, copied exactly, only richer, colder, heavier. I lifted it carefully, the metal catching my reflection, a reflection that didn't look like me anymore. There was no note, no voice, no footsteps on the road outside. Only the faint echo of my name somewhere in the wind, and the realization that the man who had once built cages out of ambition had found me again. And this time, he wasn't coming to teach me. He was coming to finish the lesson. The morning he returned, the city wore a strange quietness, as if every sound had stepped aside to make room for the footsteps of a memory I had tried to bury. The sky was the color of burnished copper, the streets still damp from night rain, and in that heavy, shimmering silence, I felt it again. The pull of something unfinished, the gravity of a past that had learned my name too well. When I looked up from my bench and saw him framed in the doorway of my workshop, the air itself seemed to pause between us. Mr. Kanu stood there exactly as I remembered. Immaculate suit, eyes that measured before they greeted, the calm of a man who had never been told no. Only this time, I wasn't the boy covered in glue and fear. I was the man who had built a name from the ruins he left behind. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, the scent of his cologne settling over the room like a reminder. His gaze drifted to the shelves lined with repaired shoes, to the gold-plated one gleaming under the lamp. "You've been busy," he said, his voice still soft enough to hide its edge. "I wondered how long it would take for you to turn pain into profit." I wiped my hands on a rag and forced my heartbeat to slow. "Why are you here?" He smiled the way men do when they already own the answer. "Because genius wastes itself in corners. You invented a pattern that bends the world's rules. I want to build with you. Your design, my reach. Together, we'll make every man in this city wear your story." For a moment, the room blurred. All I could hear was my mother's voice, warning that every bright offer hides a shadow. Yet ambition hummed louder than caution. The idea of finally being seen, truly seen, felt like forgiveness I hadn't earned. "And if I refuse?" I asked. He tilted his head. "You won't. The world only remembers those who learn to turn enemies into business partners." I shook his hand, and in that single gesture, I felt both victory and surrender. Months followed, like a dream painted in gold. Our new label, Leafline, spread faster than rumor. My stitch became fashion's secret language. Tailors copied it, editors praised it, and customers spoke my name with reverence. In photographs, Kanu and I stood side by side, the architect and the craftsman, the lie and the truth bound together in the same frame. Yet at night, when the applause faded, I caught him studying me with the quiet hunger of a man watching a flame he planned to control. The numbers began to blur again, ledgers rewritten in a handwriting too familiar. I felt the old unease creep back, the same chill that once lived inside the factory walls. But before I could confront him, he leaned close during a crowded investors' dinner, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. "Tell me, Chima," he murmured, his smile never faltering. "Do you know who owns the mall that threw you out?" The laughter around us froze. The glass in my hand slipped, shattered against the floor. And for the second time in my life, I understood that triumph can sound exactly like a trap closing. The morning she stopped blinking, the world forgot its color. The sky outside our window lost its blue. The marketplace beyond the hill fell eerily quiet. And even the birds that had always argued on the power line seemed to understand that breath had become a fragile thing. That somewhere in this small room at the edge of the city, a mother's heart was keeping time for the last time. I sat beside her, watching the light pour through the torn curtain and settle across her face, and in that glow she didn't look sick or broken. She looked like peace, wearing a human shape. like the final verse of a song that had been whispering its end for far too long. It had started months earlier, so gently that denial could disguise itself as hope. A cough that came and went, a fatigue that hid behind her smile, a needle that paused too long between stitches. She would laugh and wave it away, telling me she was fine, that the world was too loud to waste time on weakness, and I had wanted to believe her, because believing otherwise would mean admitting that I could lose the only soul who had ever seen worth in my scars. When the coughing worsened, I sold the first pair of gold-stitched shoes that had carried my name across the city. When the medicine failed, I sold my new machines. When the doctors shook their heads and began to speak in numbers, instead of promises, I began to pray to a God I wasn't sure still listened to people like us. Her bed became my world. I fed her broth that tasted of ash, wiped the sweat that no longer cooled her, whispered stories of the market where she once ruled with nothing but her laughter. Sometimes she drifted between worlds, calling out for my father, for me as a boy, for days when hunger had been our only enemy. "You've done well, my son," she said one night, her voice a thread barely holding. "You made the ground remember our name." I wanted to beg her not to speak in the end, but words deserted me. The only sound I could trust was the shallow rhythm of her breathing, and even that betrayed me by slowing, softening, fading. When her hand slipped from mine, I didn't cry. Not because I was brave, but because grief arrived too heavy for tears. It filled the room like smoke, thick and absolute, and all I could do was sit still and listen to the echo of her silence. Outside, life continued without pause, the market shouting prices, the wind carrying the smell of roasted corn. But inside me, something vast and quiet broke open. We buried her beneath the old tree near the market, the same place where she had once sold fabric and laughter to strangers. The traders came, the women who'd shared her gossip, the children who'd grown up in her stories. I stood there long after the last handful of soil fell, staring at the mound until the shadows stretched and the world lost its edges. The evening wind touched my cheek, like her fingers once had, and I heard her voice, clear as memory. "When you return to that mall, don't go as a king, go as a healer." Those words settled into me like a seed buried deep, and though I didn't yet know what they meant, I knew they were the only map she had left me. That night, in my small workshop, I sat alone with the smell of wax and thread, whispering her words again and again until they felt carved into my bones. The candle burned low, the flame shivering against the dark. Just as it began to die, someone knocked, 3 deliberate taps, and when I opened the door, the street was empty. Only an envelope waited on the step, sealed with black wax. Inside, a single sentence written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. "The mall is going bankrupt." I stared at the words until the ink blurred, and in that moment I understood that fate wasn't finished with me yet, that grief had only been its intermission. That morning began like any other, the quiet hum of the city still half asleep, the faint hiss of the kettle on the stove, the smell of wet leather and candle wax filling my workshop. But beneath that fragile calm, something in the air felt restless, as though time itself had been waiting for me to answer a question I didn't yet know was coming. The phone sat on my desk, silent for hours, until it rang with a sound that seemed too sharp for daylight, slicing through the stillness like a blade, through silk. And when I lifted the receiver, I heard the one voice I had prayed never to hear again, the same cold, certain voice that once shouted, "Thief!" before the entire market, the same voice that had chased my childhood through dust and humiliation. In that instant, years folded like paper, and I was no longer a man sitting in a room filled with success. I was again the barefoot boy standing before the gates of a mall that had spat me out into the world. "Good morning," the voice said, professional now, polished by years of power. "This is Mr. Duru, property manager for City Point Mall. We're exploring a potential buyout. Your company's name came up in our search for possible investors. Are you available for a short discussion? City Point Mall. The name alone made my pulse slow, then quicken. The same gates that once rejected me now wanted my money, my vision, my permission to breathe again. I leaned back, careful to hide the tremor in my tone. Yes, I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. Let's talk. As he spoke, listing declining revenue, vacancy rates, the burden of lost tenants, I realized that the mighty structure that once looked untouchable had grown fragile. The mall was dying, and it had come crawling to the one person who understood the anatomy of its fall. I almost laughed at the poetry of it all. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the silent phone, the ghosts of my past whispering through the static that still lingered in the room. My mother's words drifted back, soft but unshakable. When you return to that mall, don't go as a king, go as a healer. I didn't tell my partners about that voice or the history that tied me to it. When I proposed the purchase, they frowned. Why waste capital on a sinking property? One asked. This mall is a graveyard, not an investment. But some wars are fought for memory, not profit. Because graves, I said, can bloom again if you plant something worth growing. The negotiations began in whispers and signatures. I hid my identity behind intermediaries, using an alias on every document. No one in the boardroom knew that the potential buyer had once been dragged through their corridors like a criminal. I told myself I wasn't doing it for revenge. I wanted to reclaim the story, to stitch dignity into the same ground that once tasted my tears. But at night, when the city fell quiet, I could feel that thin line between justice and pride tightening around my heart. Weeks blurred into sleepless nights and meetings that drained me. The price rose higher than expected, the investors wavered, and my partners warned that I was gambling everything we'd built. Yet I couldn't stop. The more they doubted, the more my determination burned. The mall wasn't just a building. It was the echo of my mother's final lesson, calling me home. Finally, the day came. The conference room smelled of polish and power. Papers spread. Before me, pens aligned like weapons. Mr. Duru sat across the table, older now, his arrogance softened by years but still recognizable. He didn't recognize me. Not yet. To him, I was just another businessman chasing opportunity. As I reached for the pen, ready to sign away the past, the door creaked open. The sound was small but sharp, cutting through the chatter of voices. I looked up. An old man stepped inside, stooped, slow, uniform worn at the edges, his eyes carrying a lifetime of regret. It took only a heartbeat for me to know him. The guard. The same man who had dragged me through the market and slammed me against the mall's gate. His eyes met mine, confusion flickering into recognition. And before anyone could speak, the pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the table, stopping between us like fate itself waiting for an answer. The moment his eyes met mine, it was as if the years folded inward, collapsing every memory, every wound, every unanswered cry from the past into that single fragile heartbeat. And yet, what startled me most was not recognition, but the absence of it. Because the man who had once dragged me through the market's dirt, who had pressed my face against the cold gate of the mall while the crowd laughed, now looked at me with the blank courtesy one gives a stranger. The world has a cruel way of erasing its sins, I thought. And in that instant, I understood how easily time could wash away the guilt that had taken me a lifetime to outgrow. The meeting room had emptied, leaving only the scent of ink and polished wood behind. The papers were still spread across the table, the deal hanging in the balance. I followed him out into the corridor where the light from the setting sun broke through the glass, painting his frail figure in gold and shadow. His uniform was worn thin, the once crisp edges now soft with age. His cap sat slightly crooked on his head, and his shoes, the same kind he might once have caught me fixing, were cracked at the soles. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, polite confusion in his eyes. "Yes, sir?" he asked, voice low, uncertain. I searched his face for even a flicker of memory, but there was none. To him, I was simply another client, another man in an expensive suit with a signature worth guarding. For a heartbeat, I wanted to remind him, to speak my name, to throw the past back at him, to make him see the boy whose dignity he had trampled. But then I noticed the tremor in his hands, the deep lines carved around his mouth, the weariness of someone who had spent too many years opening doors for others, but none for himself. The fury I'd carried for so long began to fade, replaced by something quieter and heavier, understanding. "You've been here a long time," I said. He nodded, smiling faintly. "Since the first stone was laid. I watched this place grow, shine, then fade. Funny thing about buildings, they age faster than people do. Do you like working? Here?" He hesitated before answering. "It's a job," he said finally. "It keeps me breathing." I looked past him toward the main entrance, the same gates that had once closed in my face, and realized that vengeance would only make me smaller, but forgiveness might set me free. "What if," I said slowly, "you didn't have to stand all day guarding doors that no one remembers? What if I gave you a desk, a nameplate, a position of honor instead?" He blinked, unsure whether to laugh or believe me. "Why would you do that for an old man like me?" I smiled, because someone once taught me that even broken things deserve to be repaired. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he saluted, an old habit that seemed to carry both apology and gratitude, and walked away down the hall, his figure shrinking into the sunset. Watching him, I realized that true power was not the ability to punish, but to heal without needing witnesses. Back in the boardroom, the final papers awaited my signature. Mr. Duru spoke numbers, clauses, percentages, but his voice blurred into background noise. I could still see the guard's stooped shoulders and hear my mother's voice rising softly from memory. "When you return to that mall, don't go as a king. Go as a healer." I picked up the pen, my hand steady this time. When the ink touched paper, it felt less like a signature and more like an answer to every humiliation, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer. The deed was done. The mall that once threw me into the dust now carried my name, etched into its ownership like a scar, turned into scripture. And as I looked out over the city's dying light, I realized that sometimes victory doesn't roar. It exhales. When the gates of the mall began to open, their hinges groaned like the throat of something ancient waking from a long, uneasy sleep, and through that deep, echoing sound, I could almost hear the faint cry of a boy long buried beneath time, the echo of my own voice, trembling with fear, calling out to a world that never listened. The metallic creak spread through the morning air, rising, falling, and then dissolving into silence. And in that silence, I heard everything I had once been. The pain, the shame, the vow whispered through bloodied lips that I would one day return not to destroy, but to heal. It felt less like a door opening, and more like history itself taking a breath. I stood before the mall that had once rejected me, the building gleaming faintly beneath the pale sun, its glass cracked, but still reflecting fragments of sky. For years, it had been the temple of my humiliation, towering, untouchable, indifferent. But now it stood before me as something smaller, older, almost fragile. I watched as my reflection merged with its fading facade, the man I had become overlapping with the boy I had been. And for the first time, I understood that sometimes the places that break you are only waiting for you to return whole. As I stepped through the gates, a gust of air brushed against my face, cold and familiar, carrying with it the faint scent of leather, dust, and rain. The corridors stretched before me in dim gold light, each echo of my footsteps bouncing off the walls like fragments of an unfinished memory. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full, breathing softly with the weight of forgotten stories. Every store I passed felt like a ghost of my own history. The shoe shop where I once pressed my face to the window, dreaming of a life that seemed too big for me. The marble steps where I had stumbled while running from the guards. The broad atrium where I had fallen, the crowd's laughter ringing through the air like music for cruelty. My pulse quickened as I moved toward that center point, the spot that had branded itself into my soul. When I reached it, my knees weakened. I knelt and touched the ground. It was smooth, cold, indifferent, the same marble that had once scraped my skin raw. My hand trembled as I whispered, "I'm back." The words echoed softly, swallowed by the silence above me. And then, like a tide returning to shore, memories flooded in. The guards' shout, the weight of their hands, my mother's tears when she saw the bruises. The ache in my chest grew until it felt too big to contain, and for a long moment I simply stayed there, breathing through it, letting the ghosts see that I was no longer running. Tears found me quietly. They rolled down without resistance, not of sorrow, but of release. I had climbed through years of pain to stand here again, not as a victim, but as a witness. Every tear that touched the floor felt like a seed of peace, taking root in the very place that once held my shame. When I rose, I walked the hallways slowly, letting my fingers brush against the walls as if greeting old friends. Workers followed behind, unsure why I moved without speaking. They didn't know that every step I took was a prayer. "We'll rebuild this place," I said softly, "not just with money, but with meaning." As they left, I wandered deeper into the west wing, where the light dimmed into amber. That's when I saw it, something small, glimmering on the far wall, half hidden behind a cracked column. A plaque. My footsteps slowed as I approached. It was brass, polished despite the dust around it. I leaned closer, the words engraved in neat, deliberate script. In memory of the boy who inspired kindness, my throat tightened. I traced the letters with my fingertips, the metal warm against my skin. There was no name, no signature, only that haunting dedication. Someone, somewhere, had remembered what I'd spent my life trying to forget. My reflection flickered across the plaque like a ghost reborn, and I whispered into the still air, "Who did this?" But the silence didn't answer. It only watched, waiting for me to find out. Some people buy buildings, some buy empires, but I bought something far more fragile. I bought a memory, a place where my story had once been buried in the dust, a silence that had once swallowed my name. Standing before the gleaming glass doors of the mall that had once thrown me into the streets, I felt the morning light spill over me like a benediction, warm and forgiving, as if the sun itself wanted to rewrite the shadows of my past. The polished surface mirrored my reflection, but it wasn't just the man I saw. It was every version of myself layered within it. The barefoot boy with torn hands, the dreamer who refused to die, and the son who had promised his mother that he would return not as a king, but as a healer. When the doors opened, the scent of new paint mingled with the faint trace of leather and polish, a fragrance I had known all my life. The marble floor, once a cold reminder of humiliation, now glowed beneath the soft amber lights that streamed through the ceiling. But the transformation wasn't in the walls or the tiles. It was in the air itself. Where arrogance had once lived, hope now breathed. Where laughter had once mocked, children's voices now echoed. At the center of the atrium, where I had once fallen in defeat, stood something simple, yet sacred. My old shoemaker's stool, restored but unchanged, its wood worn smooth by years of use. Around it, a plaque shone beneath the skylight, engraved with the words that had carried me through every dark night. "Pain is not your prison. It's your teacher." My mother's voice seemed to hum through the walls when I read it, soft and steady, as if the building itself now spoke her truth. The mall had become more than a monument. It was a living heartbeat. On the lower floor, I had opened the Hearts and Hands Workshop, a scholarship space for market children, the same kind of children who once ran barefoot past me while I patched old shoes in the sun. Now they filled this place with laughter and curiosity, their small hands learning to create instead of to beg. I watched them from the balcony above, my chest heavy with something beyond pride. It was peace. One of the boys, a Kenna, reminded me of myself, eyes sharp with hunger, voice trembling with dreams too big for his frame. He once told me, "I want to fix broken things, sir." I smiled at him and said, "Then you've already started." Every day since reopening, I walked through the mall slowly, touching the walls, whispering my gratitude into the silence. I didn't need applause or headlines. I needed only to know that this place, once a symbol of my defeat, now stood as a monument to forgiveness, to creation, to the idea that healing is the truest form of revenge. At the main entrance, above the arch of the new glass gates, my mother's quote was carved in gold letters, so every visitor would read it as they stepped inside. "Pain is not your prison, it's your teacher." People often stopped there, reading it twice, sometimes thrice, unaware that those words were born from a dying woman's whisper, and that her son had spent his whole life learning what they truly meant. That evening, long after the crowd had left, I walked one last time through the glowing halls. My footsteps echoed softly, not as reminders of loss, but as proof of return. I paused at my stool, laid my palm upon the wood, and said quietly, "Mama, the boy you raised has kept his promise." I turned toward the exit, my reflection following me in the glass like a shadow set free. Just as I stepped outside, a young voice called out behind me, bright and curious, "Sir, can I fix your shoes?" I stopped. Slowly I turned. A boy stood there by the gate, barefoot, holding a wooden box filled with old tools, his eyes full of the same hunger that once burned in mine. And as the light caught his face, I felt the story I thought had ended begin all over again, not as history repeating, but as destiny reborn. If this story touched a part of you that you'd forgotten, don't let it fade here. Share it with someone who still believes pain only destroys. Tell them pain can build too. Subscribe for more stories that remind us how broken roads can still lead home, because sometimes the next story might just be yours.